We're moving from anger to lust, and it's one of the things that is inherent in us in the sex drive. Sex is a drive, like food. It's a drive for survival in men, and especially in men. Okay, men and women, but in men, no boy turns 13 and says, "Man, all I can think about is stealing all day long." No, we think about other things though, and that is sex. And so we're going to talk about healthy relationships of sex and the unhealthy relationship of lust. It doesn't just have to do with sex, though. Jesus is moving on from anger into the next natural thing that needs to be transformed within. And it's not by saying, just say no. Stick around. Greetings and blessings, and welcome to the All Nations Under God YouTube podcast channel. It's Chris Wood. We are talking today about lust. We're working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' teaching, call this Building Your Life on the Rock series, because of the end of this sermon, the very end, which is Matthew chapter 5 through 7. That's the Sermon on the Mount, okay? He ends his sermon with these words that, whoever hears these words of mine and does them, let me tell you what he's like. He's like a man who built his house on the rock. And so that when the floods came, and the rain fell, and the winds blew against that house, it did not fall. Because it was built and founded on the rock. But the person who hears these words of mine and doesn't do them, let me tell you what he's like. He's like someone who builds his house on the sand. So that when the rains fall, and the floods come, and the winds blow against that house, it fell. And tragic, great. The word is tragic was its fall. And so that is how Jesus ends this sermon. So his emphasis is that these are things that you should hear and do. And so we are focusing, of course, on that second part of the application, which is often neglected in churches. They do a good job of telling you the things that Jesus said, telling you to do the things that Jesus said. Not a good job of the Great Commission, which is teaching them to do everything that I have commanded you. And so that is what we are trying to do here in this series. We looked last week at anger. Now we're into the ethical treatment. We said at the beginning of this series, Jesus is asking four major questions. What is reality? What is real? He says it's God and His kingdom. And we looked at that, the gospel that Jesus preached. You should check that video out if you haven't started in the beginning of the series. We're talking about these questions. Who has the blessed life? What's the good life? And he says those who are entering the kingdom, and it's available now to everyone, to the people that the religious, and the power mongers said, those people aren't blessed, they're cursed by God. He says, no, even the kingdom's available even to such as these, you see. And so we looked at the blessed life, and it's the salt and the light people. Salt of the earth, the light of the world, those who are entering into the kingdom. So it starts with redemption. He's got a systematic way of teaching this, okay? What is good? Who's a good person? What is righteousness? And so he says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribe and the Pharisee, you shall never enter the kingdom of the heavens. That's verse 20 of Matthew 5. And we talked about the views of righteousness that are out there that do violence to Jesus' word exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees. And we got more Pharisees. We've got people who are obsessed with every single little thing you do. Is it a sin? And you live on a razor's edge. You sin, you die, so you're out. And so every single thing that you do in your life, Jesus said that is not a way to live. You need to work on the inward transformation out of which all your actions flow. Because we ferret sin out from our heart to our bodies. Okay? And so we need to work on the heart, and it's the heart set free, the kingdom heart that Jesus is concerned about. That is the righteousness that will exceed, and he's going to get very practical in the answering to that last question which we are working on. And he started with anger, remember, and its cousin contempt. And we talked a little bit in a video. You should check it out about fasting and how that deals with anger. Okay, the spiritual disciplines, we're going to do that again with this one. But we got to start with defining and understanding our terms. And it is lust that Jesus deals with next. Because anger and lust, they go hand in hand. They are the base drives of the sinful heart. And we need to put them in order. And we talked about how anger was not, it's not a choice. Anger is like pain. It happens to you. What you do with it becomes the choice. Same goes with lust. The word lust. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the word because it's come to mean only one thing in our society. And that is a negative sexual attraction, a negative sexual desire. That's not what the word epithumia in the Greek means throughout the scriptures. It means good things too. You can strongly desire, with this same word, strongly desire good things. I earnestly desire to eat this Passover with you, Jesus said. It's the same word that we're going to look at in our passage here. And so it's not always negative. But what is negative about this word in the passage? Let's look at our text. Okay, we're in Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. Today is about lust. And Jesus is going to go right from anger into lust, and we'll talk about that. Why? Because he is teaching systematically. He's the smartest human who has ever walked this earth, and the best teacher who has ever lived. And so he teaches intelligently. And in verse 27, he picks up from anger. "To you have heard that it was said," and he leaves out "to those of old," like he did with anger, but they understand. He's quoting Moses, who he said he's not come to put away. "You've heard that it was said that you shall not commit adultery," verse 27. "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it's better for you to lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into Gehenna." Hell is translated here, Gehenna. "And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." The same word, Gehenna, that he used in verse 22. When if you tell your brother, "You fool, you're a godless person, you're hopeless," you'll be liable to the Gehenna of fire, he says. The garbage heap, the Valley of Hinnom. It was in the southwest corner of Jerusalem. It was a real place. It's where they disposed of all the garbage. But they also disposed of people. They had no proper right to burial with the people, you see. And so it was where you went when you were excluded, without hope, without... Now, of course, that was abused, okay? You just look at the political climate that Jesus came into, of the Sadducees and Pharisees and the corruption and all these things. And if you understand what was going on in Jerusalem, were there good, God-fearing people who ended up, because they were poor, ended up in Gehenna? There were. Does that mean they're in eternal hell? Of course not. It's a different word. All right? So this Gehenna he's talking about is a very practical thing. He's talking about being excluded from the hope in the people of God. More fearful than some kind of future punishment or something. No. The fear that is a living hopelessness to be excluded from the people of God. And the Pharisees thought that they had a stranglehold on who was in and who was out, and it was because they could see whether or not they adhered to their ritual, the outward expressions of ritual adherence that told them that the person is righteous. Meanwhile, they could be wicked to the core in their heart, is what Jesus is saying and showing in his righteousness here. All right, so lust, epithumia, it comes from when he says that if you look at a woman with lustful intent, is the ESV, and that's a really good translation. And so we're going to talk about the different translations that you might have. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It's a very good literal translation. I really enjoy it. I'm going through it. They all have problems. English has problems. That's the problem. You see. But this is a good translation, the ESV, and a good translation of this verse, which is 28, okay? I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. All right. So we're talking about adultery in the heart. Now, we're going to look at adultery and that word next week when we look at divorce. When we look at who can commit adultery, all right? But he's talking about lust in the heart here. He's talking about epithumia. Pros means in order to. Okay, in the Greek, look at your Greek, and you'll see that this does not mean you look at a woman and find her attractive, and then that's not what it's talking about. Talking about intent of the heart. We're talking about not a righteousness based on just what you do. We're talking about a righteousness that says, I'm not going to intend to lust after this person and look at her for that reason. To dehumanize. Okay? Objectify. Alright, so we got to talk about what he is saying and what he's not saying. And he's not talking about thoughts. And he's not even talking about temptation. Okay? He's talking about giving in to the temptation to your evil desires and to lust after a woman intentionally. And to look at her for that reason. And we'll look at his little brother, James, who talks about this, that there's a progression to sin. But it's not about thoughts, and it's not about temptation. Temptation is not a sin. How do I know? Because Jesus was tempted in all things, yet without sin, you read will say. So temptation in itself is not a sin. But temptation happens because of thoughts and desires that are unholy, that are out of whack with your humanity, that are sinful, but not sin. They are wrong, but they're not going to cut you off from God's fellowship, you understand? But you have to, so in order to transform the intent to lust after women, we got to move backwards to what's causing me to be tempted to do it, what's causing me to think about this that's causing a temptation, okay? So we're going to look at that progression of what actually is a sin, okay? So when I say those thoughts are sinful, that doesn't mean they're sin. It means that they're unholy and they're not wise for you to we start sitting in them. You start cultivating this thought and this lust, okay? But epithumia itself, the word here, lustful intent, great translation. The King James is good if you understand the nuance and you read closely. I've heard this preached though, that is so unhealthy for people that it makes them feel like they're sinning and they have no control over it. And that's what, if you're getting to the point where you feel like God is unreasonable, that he's not practical, that Jesus is a fool, basically, and doesn't know the human condition, you're missing the point. Go back, repent, which means change your mind about your thinking about that, and read the verse again. Read it in some different translations. If you're into the Greek, like me, if you're into your Greek Bible and you're looking at it and you want to translate and understand, pros to epithumesai, autes, okay? Looking at those women in order to lust. That's what he's saying. Okay? The intent is to look at them, dehumanize them. They're objects. We're going to talk about that what this does. And where does pornography come into this? And why is this after anger? And what does it have the relationship to do with anger? You know, and so there's a systematic reason that Jesus uses this. Now, this is not just lust after sex, sexual lust. He uses that as the example. But this could be anything. You could turn anything, even good things, into a sinful lust of cultivating for self-gratification. And for that purpose of it. And so, but he focuses on sex because it is the drive in man, and because it is something that sin is going to try to take advantage of. All right? And is this relevant to our culture? Come on. I'm all over the forums of Christian thought, of people who are asking questions of Christianity. But there is an outcry. They've even created their own forums for the addiction to pornography, for this kind of lust, for what our culture is sinful in and proud of. And it's ruining marriages, families, lives. Not to mention the people who are being abused in this billion-dollar industry, family. Come on. So, Jesus is very practical. His teachings are very relevant. And it affects all of us. Because we're human. Okay? And so, gluttony is he speaks more about gluttony than he does about adultery, Jesus, and fornication. And so, food and sex are drives in us that can be absolutely twisted to the sinful point of self-gratification. Okay, and so we have to know that, and know that Jesus is not being irrational and saying that if you're attracted to a woman, that's a sin. That's not what he's saying at all. Alright? Though if you're married, there's a different, you made a vow before God, publicly. That's different. We're going to talk about that when we get to divorce and adultery, okay? We will talk about the woman caught in adultery, we'll talk about the word, and we'll talk about the term. Here we're talking about adultery in the heart, the lust. Looking at someone with the intent that your reason you're looking at them is to objectify them for your self-gratification. This is the adultery in the heart that we're talking about. Okay. Alright, so we're going to put this up on the screen. Some translations of modern translations and things, and English translations that they're not all modern. The King James is 1611, but it's a popular translation. So I want to look at the differences in chapter 5, verse 28 of the translations here, okay? So let's start with let's put this up on the screen. We got the King James Version, which says, "But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, hath already committed adultery with her in his heart." New King James likewise, "But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her, has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Those are pretty good. Those are actually pretty good if you understand the intent, that there's an intent here. To lust means in order to lust. You're looking at her in order to lust. That's what the Greek is saying. But the NLT, the New Living Translation, says, "But I say to you, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart." That's a different message. That's different. Now, again, this word epithumia isn't a negative term. Okay, it can be negative. It is negative here, if you're understanding that it's attached to the purpose of lusting after. Not a guy is attracted to a woman and has a strong desire to be with her. They're both single. That's a good thing. Alright? That's not what he's talking about. Certainly not talking about attraction, which is not a choice. Alright. Let's look at some more popular ones. The NIV and the Revised Standard Version, they both say something, again, not very good. "I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." That's kind of a cop-out. The lustfully part. You don't know what that means. Do you mean that he looks at her and then he desires her? Or, it's not good. The NASB, likewise, really bad. "I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Again, you're not understanding the intent that's coming from the Greek verb. And the ESV is my favorite here, though. It's a good literal translation. "I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." That's the best translation of the modern English versions that I found, is the ESV. Alright? That doesn't mean that the ESV is the only Bible that can help you to be saved. That's not what I'm saying at all. Alright? But I'm saying I like the fact that they get this right. Because this is important. There are differences that make a difference. That's what this podcast and YouTube channel is about. We're discussing the differences that make a difference, and this is one of them that is, which is the intent in the lustful glare that objectifies a person for your own self-gratification, that dehumanizes women and men. And men. Women do this. Okay? This is not only a male thing. This is a human thing. And with the rise of pornography being available at the click of a mouse, you can ruin your heart and its ability to have true intimacy, which is what pornography does. We're going to talk about this. It's an epidemic. With one mouse click, though, today. That's the availability of it is just a mouse click away. And kids as young as 10 years old, little kids, are being force-fed this dehumanization, using people as objects and creating a fantasy of sexuality that is never fulfilled, and removing intimacy and replacing it with a fake plastic sexuality and this lustful desire. But we're going to look at some other uses of this in the negative sense, because this is a negative sense, that show you that it's not just about sex. You can lust after other things as well. Okay? So then we're going to look at the idiom that Jesus uses about removing your eye, cutting off your hand and things. I'm going to show you why in this use of it here, because he'll use it other places too, differently. Can Jesus do that? Can he use the same idiom in different ways? Yes, he can. And he does. The context is key. So let's investigate our New Testament to look at this word, epithemia, and see that it's not always negative, that the context is going to dictate it. It's negative here. We're talking about looking at a woman with the intent of epithemia, of lusting after her. Okay? So we're talking about adultery in the heart. It's not in the act. It's in the willingness to act. It's in the desire to objectify. But this word, epithemia, in itself is not negative. In spite of the King James being a decent translation of this verse and passage, the problem is they take that word epithemia and they always translate it lust. That's not, and then lust is attached to the 7 deadly sins kind of lust, you know. It's always, and like in our culture, has become a term that only means sexual, inappropriate sexual desire and things. That's not always what this word means. So let's look at a couple positive examples in your New Testament. If you have your Bible, get it out. If you don't have a Bible on you, download the Blue Letter Bible app. You can search all these translations with the Blue Letter Bible. And that's the wonderful thing. You can search one verse and see different translations. And so that's a wonderful tool to have. We're going to look at Luke 22:15, the words of Jesus. Jesus using this word, saying that he epithemias. And so it's not always negative. Luke 22:15, it's the Passover meal. He's finally arrived to have this meal with his 11. Judas has left. I have earnestly desired, it's the word, epithemia, to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. This is a positive thing. Jesus had an earnest desire, an epithemia, to eat his Passover meal with his disciples before he suffered. Philippians chapter 1:23, Paul in prison. Turn over to Philippians 1:23. Paul's in prison by a lunatic named Nero, falsely in prison, mind you, for one claim to be the Egyptian. He's falsely accused of being a figure who is killing Roman soldiers and things, the leader of a messianic revolt. And he's not that person, obviously. So it's a false claim. But he's also there for civil disobedience by proclaiming that Jesus is Lord. That claim he's guilty of. And he's happy to be guilty of that. Jesus is Lord. Caesar is not. And so he knows he's about to go before someone who demands that all his servants, especially those under Roman subjugation like Jews, who are not even citizens. Well, he's a citizen, though. What's that mean? Well, it means he had the privilege to go before Caesar himself, to take his claim to him. But he's going before one who demands to be called Kurios, Lord. demanded that they refer to him as our Lord and Savior, Nero Caesar. And Paul says, no, Jesus Christ is Kurios. So in Philippians 1:23, he knows he's about to do this, and it's probably going to mean his death. He's hard-pressed between dying and wanting to continue the mission here on earth. And so he says in 1:23, my epithemia, my desire, is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. You see, and so his epithemia, his desire, his strong desire, this epithemia, this is our word. Now there are other times, though, and this is important because Jesus is using it in a negative sense here. We want to look at other times it's used by Jesus and others, and Paul we'll look at, about a negative epithemia. And he uses it in Mark 4. We're going to look at 19. It's the parable of the sower. Remember, the sower goes out sowing seed, okay, and falls on different grounds. The seed, Jesus says, is the word of God. The grounds are the hearts of men. In 4:19 of Mark, the cares of the world, though, the deceitfulness of riches, and the epithemia for other things, enter in and choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful. Enter in what? Into the heart. That's what the soil is. It's the heart of men. The epithemia here is not just a sexual desire for a woman or a man. It is the epithemia for other things that choke out the word of God. It's idolatry. Coveting is idolatry, remember Paul would say. Pray that none of you becomes a covetous person, which is idolatry. He says that 2 different times. Well, why is coveting idolatry, and what does that have to do with this? We're going to look at that when we'll talk about the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew. Covet was our same word here, all right? Epithemia. And that's important because the law. All right, we'll come back to that. But this is the idea that your desires, your strong desires for all kinds of other things, other than the things of God, will choke out. They enter into your heart and choke out the word, choke out the promises of God, the trust in Him, the hope you have. All right. So that's a use of our word epithemia. It's Mark 4:19. But then in Romans 1, this is really important because we're going to get into James's explanation of how sin happens. And at what is a sin and what is not a sin. And that's important with the misuses of this passage we're looking at about lust. There are abuses of this passage to make people feel like they are sinning when they are not sinning. When they are just doing things like having thoughts. Alright, thoughts are not sin. Temptation, not a sin. Jesus was tempted in all things. I mean, that means that temptations are not sins, okay? They're not good for you. Alright, they can become things that choke out the word. And James will say that, and we'll talk about that. We'll bring it up on screen and we'll see that there's a progression that leads to sin. But in Romans 1:24, there's a progression here as well, which is important for understanding of this principle. Because he's now talking about the power of the gospel. He's talking about what humans in rebellion have done. Is that they've removed God from their knowledge. They become futile in their thinking. In Romans 1:24, therefore, God gave them up to the epithemia of their hearts to impurity. The lust of their heart to impurity. Because, why? Because they became futile in their thinking, they removed God from their knowledge, and now what's happening to the heart? Epithemia. Now what's happening to the heart is an epithemia to impurity. To the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. So you see this progression of thoughts. You remove God from your knowledge, you become futile in your thinking. It affects your heart. Your heart begins to lust after all kinds of impure things and stuff, and then it dishonors your body. We ferret sin from our thoughts to our heart, outward to our body. There's a progression. And James' little brother is going to tell us that and show us that. But I wanted to clear this up about the use of our word the context is going to dictate whether it's a positive, strong desire or not. But if they're strong desires that are covetous, and in the Septuagint, now here's what, if you don't know, the Septuagint is a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. It was done in about between 200 and 150 BC by many scholars, but 70 are the ones who did the final translation. So the Septuagint is not a one-person translation. It is a council of 70 who then have helpers underneath them and stuff, scribes and things like that. But it's written between 200 and 150 BC. The Septuagint was written from the Hebrew into a Greek Old Testament. It's the only thing that existed at the time. All right, so when it talks about the Scriptures in your New Testament, it's talking about that, the Old Testament. And most of the time, people are quoting from the Septuagint. Even your New Testament authors were quoting from it. And so, when they translated the Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments, the term covet, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife, apothymia. This is our word. Well, what does that mean? Well, Jesus was just coming off talking how he did not come to put away the law. Kitty? And now he's quoting the law. Thou shalt not commit adultery. He's saying that coveting is committing adultery. Coveting in your heart, your neighbor's wife. And he'll say the Pharisees' righteousness was based on, I didn't do it. I didn't commit adultery. I didn't actually sleep with her. He says if you covet her in your heart, you have done it. Oh. So Jesus is going to the intention. Jesus is going to something much deeper than the action. And it's consistent with how sin works. Because the thief is not just the one who steals. The thief is the one who would steal. Jesus is looking for a different kind of righteousness, remember? And he's saying it starts in the heart. It's the heart being set free from evil desires, from the negative epithemias. And coveting is one of them. And this is what happens when you covet, you epithemia, all kinds of other things in your heart. It chokes out the word of God. Because you start to idolize. It's idolatry. I should have that. That should belong to me. And you're no longer trusting God to provide for you what is good for you. Okay? And so this epithemia, this lusting, this adultery of the heart is a deeper, different kind of righteousness than the Pharisees. Alright, let's look at little brother, James, and his idea of this progression. It's all over Scripture. There's a progression to sin. It starts in the mind, in the heart, and we ferret it out to our bodies. Okay? Chapter 1 of James, and then we'll put it up on screen, this progression to sin. We'll look at 13, start at 13, but then we'll read 14 and 16 in our progression. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. You see this progression? Okay? So the progression to sin here in James 1, 14 to 16, it's really 14 and 15. Number one is the unholy thoughts and desires, alright? This is not sin. It's not good for you. But when those desires turn to number two, to temptation for those unholy desires, and you give in to that temptation, whether you physically do it or not, you are now determined to do it. Opportunities, they're going to come, always. Alright? But opportunity and your temptation is not the sin. The sin is giving into it. When you give in to temptation, that's number 3. That's the sin. Now you can give in to temptation in your heart. You can be committed to doing it. You haven't done it yet, but you've sinned in your heart, Jesus says. Because your epithemia, your desire, is to do it. You have the intent to do it. Jesus said that's the sin. It's a sin that goes beyond, exceeds, is a different kind of righteousness. It's about the heart. And so, again, temptations are not sin, but see, we have to re-engineer and reverse order this idea of sin so that we change our desires, so that we are not tempted all the time, being tossed around by our desires. We do this by the will. That's why anger comes first. It's a will phenomenon. That's why putting yourself to death, and watch our video on anger if you haven't, to see about that, why he starts with anger, and why, because that's a phenomenon of the will, it's putting yourself to death daily that begins the way to guard your heart against these things and change you from the inside. Okay? And so we're looking at this progression, and we have to reverse the order, and so that when our desires are right, to love God, which means to will His good, to love ourselves, which means to will our own good. We're not going to give ourselves everything we desire if we love ourselves. I desire cheesecake. I'm a type 1 diabetic. If I love me, I'm not going to allow myself to have it. Not all the time. Not whenever I want it. Alright? I have a birthday once a year, maybe I'll have a slice. It's different. But you see that about being ruled by your desires is going to make you fall into all kinds of temptations, and the opportunities are always going to come. But if you change your desires from the inside, and it starts with the thoughts, fixing your mind on things above. Do not be conformed to this world, Romans 12:2. Be transformed by what? The renewing of your mind. It starts with the mind, and then set apart Christ Jesus in your heart. These are the ways that you can overcome sinful patterns and behaviors, is not by trying to stop doing sinful patterns and behaviors. You have to change from the inside. Clean the inside of the cup, Jesus said. And all the rest of it will be cleansed, you see. The Pharisees cleansed the outside. The things that people saw them doing. Inside full of all kinds of evil. And that's evident in their relationship to women. We're going to see about that next week in divorce. But it was true also in this principle. Because they would make women wear all kinds of things. Now we're going to get into the third section of this, which is how to respond to this. But we have to be clear about what is a sin and what is not. The thought's not the sin. Thinking someone's attractive and desiring to be with them, that's not a sin. There would be no marriage if that wasn't, that didn't happen. Attraction is not a choice, so it's not a sin. What you do with it is going to be a matter of the heart. Because if you love someone, you will their good. And their good is not for you to objectify them. And make them into an object and not a person. And there's an epidemic in our culture that it's a sickness of people as objects. And then we try to get intimacy from the objects in our life, like our Xbox and things. Try to find fulfillment and happiness in objects, and we take people who, if we have loving relationships with, will give us fulfillment. That's what we're here for. Instead, we make them into objects to use for our own self-gratification, and because of that, we have no intimacy at all. And I don't just mean sexual intimacy. I mean intimacy is friendship and one anotherness, fellowship. This is the huge problem. And it's mostly because we have based our righteousness on the Pharisees and scribes, on the things we do or don't do. Doesn't change you. Doesn't get you there. We need to have the inward transformation of the kingdom heart. It started with putting yourself to death, taking up your cross daily to follow Jesus. And that will deal with your anger. what happens to you when your will is crossed. And it will deal with your view of others. See, it starts with the self, and now it's going to others. We're not going to view them as an object or an opportunity for us to get what we want. Love is to will the good of another. And so there are people who say, well, I never committed adultery with that woman, but you make her feel uncomfortable every time she walks in a room. You see? The people who are lusting, intentfully looking to lust after this woman. I can't wait till so-and-so shows up. Man, she's slamming and I'm gonna... You know what I'm saying? So you've already done it, Jesus says. You've already committed adultery in the heart with that person. And this is not... He uses the term adultery, but we're talking about fornication too. We're talking about any kind of sexual lust, because coveting is the issue. Alright? Coveting another person, turning them into an object. And that's why pornography is such a damaging thing for the heart. It ruins intimacy. It ruins true intimacy, the ability to even, for some guys, to even have a conversation with a woman. Because you're turning people into objects. And there would be no pornography without contempt. Think about that. The willingness to degrade someone, to debase them, to defile them. The contempt it creates to see them willing to be degraded creates more contempt in you for women. And not just that woman, for women in general. That was prevalent when Jesus was speaking these words. The absolute degradation of women, the horrible treatment of women, even within the wisdom traditions that Jesus is responding to. Because that's what he's doing, is responding to the prevailing wisdom of the age. And Ben Sirach, Ecclesiasticus it's called, the wisdom of Ben Sirach, in your Catholic Bible, or in your Apocrypha, or it's in the public domain. That was the prevailing thought of the time. Was a lot of Ben Sirach was absolutely espoused by the Pharisees and things. Look at the treatment of women in that book. Just get it and search. Do a search for a woman in Ben Sirach. And look at all the passages, women and women. And see, horrible view of women. Because what they were doing was placing the blame on the woman, saying, so they had all kinds of rules. A woman should wear a veil at all times, so that she doesn't tempt the person who's lusting after her. The problem is you. The one who's lusting, your heart is the problem. It's not the woman, the way she's dressed. And this happens today in trials. And a woman's raped, and oh well, look at how she was dressed. What? It doesn't matter. Now, of course it does for her, as far as... But no, that doesn't mean that you're now off the hook in your responsibility to not have epithemia in your heart, in a negative sense. The lustfulness and willingness and intent to objectify. But also, what's unhealthy is the mistreatment of the self and the willingness and attempt to remove this epithemia, this lust, as even an opportunity. And in that, people have gone to extremes of asceticism to try to remove lustfulness in the heart, to the point where Stanley Jones tells a story that when he converted to Christianity, he grew up in a Hindu caste system. In the high priesthood Hindu, he was in the higher caste of priests. The whole family was immediately trying to get him to come back and to renounce Christ and to accept the tenets of Hinduism. So they brought him back to India. They brought him up to a mountain, to the most holy person of their caste system, who was living up in a mountain. Most holy and wise person living in isolation in a mountain. They brought him there, and the first thing, Jones recounts the story, In his book, the Unchanging Person and the Unshakable Kingdom. Reverse that. The Unshakable Kingdom and the Unchanging Person is the name of the book. E. Stanley Jones. Amazing book. I think he actually recounts it also in the Christ of the Mount, which is his commentary on the Sermon on the Mount, and I'll put a link to that below. Wonderful book. He says that he got up to there and met the man. It wasn't Yoshinanga. It was another relative of Yoshinanga, though. And so he meets him, and the first thing the guy says to Jones, "I haven't seen a woman in over 40 years." And Jones' reply in his way was, "Well, obviously it's not in your mind, is it?" That didn't help him. Removing the opportunity will not help your desires. And that's important when we come to what Jesus says next, which is his idiom about plucking out your eye and things. It's not going to help you. So he's not using that in a prescriptive way. He's not telling you that if your eye sins, to cut it out. He's telling you that that's not going to help you. He's telling you what the Pharisees would tell you, because it's all about the doing. He's saying, no, if lust is in your heart, and coveting and lustfulness is coveting another person as an object, you could cut your eye out, it ain't going to stop that. You could go up in a mountain and never see it, it's not going to stop that. No, it's not about removing the opportunities, it's about changing you from the inside, your desires. So they were doing all kinds of aestheticism. It doesn't work. The mistreatment of your body for a spiritual purpose doesn't work. Now, that's not the same as spiritual disciplines. It's not the same as fasting. It's not the same as depriving yourself for a small amount of time of one thing in order to get something else, which is the real food of God, is what fasting, you're feasting. Okay? So, something you can do in your power that allows God to do something that you cannot do on your own strength. It's not the same thing as cutting off your hand. And now you can't do anything with your hand. Well, that's not true. If you're a thief and they cut your hands off, like some cultures do, well, you're going to run in and grab the bag with your mouth and run out. See? If the desire of the heart is bad, you will find a way to do it. And so you've already done it, Jesus said. The thief is not just the one who steals. The adulterer is not just the one who commits the act. It's the one who would and wants to, and with lustful intent looks at a woman in order to picture himself committing adultery or fornication with that woman. You're using a person as an object. This is adultery in the heart. There are ways to combat this. Okay? There are many different things. I don't know you. It's hard to disciple from afar. But I will teach you the spiritual disciplines that have helped me. It doesn't mean they're all going to help you. It doesn't mean you need all of this. Okay? But I'm on the forums. And for the last week and a half about lust, it is prevalent. They've created new forums for Christians just because of pornography. This is the number one issue. Because it's attached to a natural drive in us. Okay? Sexuality is not a choice, it's a drive. Some have it stronger than others. When you give into it, it's going to give you even stronger. And that's true with pornography because you're not giving into a physical act. You're giving into a fantasized lust of an unrealistic sexual experience rooted in contempt. Oh, your heart is going to be brutalized. And so many are. Marriages are ruined. People's lives are ruined. Intimacy is completely destroyed. There's a way, though, we can come back from this. If this is something that's affecting you. We're going to talk in our next little video on the spiritual discipline to combat these about solitude and silence. The furnace of transformation. That's what solitude is called. In several different wisdom places of wise disciples throughout the ages. And it is the place that Jesus, as was his custom, set himself apart to be alone for stretches of time. And so we're learning about the disciplines of Jesus that helped him to be disciplined, to have the faith, not just our faith in Jesus, to have the faith of Jesus. We need to do the things that Jesus did, and that his disciples have done throughout the ages, that have proved tested and true. But we need to do them in a healthy way that is balanced. And so solitude is not isolation, not the same thing at all. Alright? So we will talk about that in our next video on solitude. But what I'm getting at here is an understanding of what it is that actually is a sin. It's not thinking a woman's attractive. Alright? It's not wanting to be with that woman. If she's single and you're single, this is of God. Now, there's more than just the attraction and the availability. There's now the character. And you're a certain kind of person. If you're a Christian, you're a different kind of creature. Okay? You want to be. And when you don't want to be, you want to be. You see. And say that I am set apart. I've set apart Christ in my heart, and he set me apart in his love. And so I'm a different kind of creature. And that's something that Paul says you should share that with the person that you choose as your partner. Because if you don't share that, they're going to be epithemy, lusting after other things in their heart. And that could choke out the word. And if you're lusting after all kinds of other things in your heart, repent. And a good way to start is by implementing these spiritual disciplines we'll talk about. Alright, so solitude and silence is coming. The video on that. But if you haven't watched our one on fasting, fasting and prayer is a good regular practice as well. But as far as pornography and stuff, get it out of your life. You know that folder that says Taxes 2012, guys? On your computer? Yeah, permanently delete that. Break down the shrines in your high places. Smash the shrines of your high places. Alright? Purge yourself of the availability. But that's not going to get you there. It's a start. It's important. But that's not the righteousness that exceeds. Now you have to do the inward transformation of the heart. Now you have to start with these principles to get you back to a place where God is your sustenance, where God is all that you need, where people are no longer objects. They are created in the image of God just as you are. They are loved by God and he wants them back just as you are. And so it's our view of others. And people as objects is a huge problem right now in our culture. And the way to address that is with prayer for them. Prayer for yourself about them. You don't interfere in this marriage. That you don't get in the way and make somebody stumble. That God is your provider. And there will be someone for you if your desire is to get married. But you have to become the kind of person you want to be with. And that's not a person who objectifies others. If you want to be a kingdom person. I hope that this helps you understand a little bit about lust. It's one of the biggest topics on the forums right now because pornography is so available readily at the click of a mouse. You can ruin your heart and your intimacy with fantasized sexual things, gratification and things. But there's more to it than that. There would be no pornography without contempt. So anger is where he started, and lust is a natural next step of what happens. But it's not just sexual lust. Remember, lust of all kinds of things chokes out the heart, chokes the word out of the heart, And so getting a grip on this, it's going to start with taking up your cross daily. There is a progression. So if you haven't seen the video on anger, if you haven't been following in this series, I recommend going back to the beginning and watching. But if you haven't been in the ethical treatment, it starts with anger. And so fasting is a great principle, fasting and prayer. Watch our video about fasting and what it actually is, and feasting, and some tips I have there. We're going to talk about solitude and silence and turning off the distractions of the world around us for a time, so that we are in the presence of God alone. And what that's not going to be easy if you've never done that. So I take this slow. Don't be a hero. All right. We'll talk about that when we get to the next video. But there are ways that we can. If you did certain things to get to the point where your heart is this way, you can do certain things to remove this as well. You have to detox. Now, what about verses 29 through 30, where Jesus uses this well-known idiom about if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, cast it away. It's better for you to enter with one eye than for your whole body to be thrown into Gehenna. All right. He is contrasting the righteousness of the Pharisees with the kingdom righteousness in the heart. Pharisees was about do not commit adultery. The heart is about no. Do not even intentfully lust after a woman to have a sexual gratification with her in your heart, because you've already committed adultery. So he's going to take coveting, which is an inward sin, and say that that's already doing it. The outward sin that they would say they didn't do. They'd say, if your eye is causing you to sin, plug it out. He's mocking them. He's mocking what they say and saying it doesn't help. And we see that in asceticism doesn't work. Removing opportunity doesn't work. It's about the desires in the heart. Viewing the women as a problem and making laws that they can't have any skin showing and things. That's not it either. That doesn't help your heart. The onus is on the heart of the person. It's on you to not have sinful adultery in the heart, lusting after other people as objects. So, what about the other times Jesus uses this idiom and he seems to be using it in a positive sense? He seems to mean it. He does. It's in, we'll look at Matthew, we don't have to look there, but we'll talk about it and you can look at it yourself. In Matthew 18, 7 through 9, in the same book, he's going to use the same idiom in a different way. Can he do that? Can Jesus do that? Of course he can do that. He's wise and he wants us to be wise. He wants us to read for the meaning and understand. Mark chapter 9, 42 to 50, and both of them are parallel chapters in that he's talking about the same kind of thing, which are evildoers in your company who are causing young in faith to sin, to stumble, giving them temptations to sin. And he's saying, cut them off, cut them out, who are doing that. That's a different context than this. What Jesus is doing here, and in the Sermon on the Mount in general, is not just a theory. He's creating a people, the salt of the earth, the light of the world people. People called out of the world into the kingdom. Because God is real. His kingdom is real. The good life is being a part of that kingdom. That's the beginning. That's entering into this covenant of salt and light, which is a covenant under the incredible guidance of the law of God. In your heart, though, as Jeremiah 31 said. And so it's a heart righteousness. It's an inward transformation. It's not the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees who were trying to get their righteousness by doing the things of the law and their own ritual traditions, and saying it's all about if you do them or don't do them, you see? And Jesus says, no, it's about the heart. And the right heart will fulfill the law in love, because it loves God with all of its heart, with all its mind, with all its soul and strength. And therefore it loves itself, and it's going to will its own good after it wills the good of God. It's going to will its own good. And then it will the good of your neighbors, which means you're not going to covet your neighbor's wife or daughter. It's not just about adultery, it's about fornication as well. It's about inappropriate sexual behavior. Alright, so I truly think that that's how Jesus is using this idiom here. He's not telling you to go and be a mutilated stump because it's not going to change your heart. Use some common sense. Understand that your drive for sex is about being a human. It's about wanting to do the very first command, be fruitful and multiply. It's about, just like food is, a drive to survive. Both of them can be disastrous for you. Natural things that can be disastrous. And so, sometimes the worst disaster, though, is prohibition. It doesn't work. It doesn't change the heart. Just say no is about action. And it isn't good. Knowing why is about intent. And that's what we need. Alright? You tell me what you think in the comments. What do you think? I'm going to post some links to the couple books that I've mentioned throughout the series so far. That E. Stanley Jones book. I'll post a link to Dallas Willard's Divine Conspiracy. Great commentary on Sermon on the Mount. There are a couple great commentaries on Matthew. I'll post some links there too, okay? French's commentary, brilliant on Matthew. Wonderful. Do I agree with everything that every one of these men say? No. Not always. Some of the stuff is brilliant and wise, though. And so, I recommend them to you. Keep up with this series. Check out our thing on solitude and silence, the next spiritual discipline. Alright? So God bless you. I hope that this helps in some way. Because we need help in this way. And the way to not treat people as objects is realize you are not an object. You are loved by God. So surrendering to Him and His kingdom. Becoming a disciple of His beloved Son through redemption first. Reconciliation first. And now you're called a son and daughter of God. And now His law is something on your heart that you want to do. And so the answer to lust is love. And the answer to objectifying and treating people as objects is to will their good as a creation of God, beloved by Him. You see? And the answer to pornography and things is to will your own good, to not want to destroy your intimacy. No one ever says, notice how well adjusted he's become since he got on the porn. Have you ever heard that? Of course not. Of course not. It's destructive to intimacy and to real love. Love of God, love of yourself, and love of other people as created in the image of God. God bless your family. I hope this helps. Be well.